to the Goldsmiths Debating Society for giving me this opportunity to speak about what I feel is a very important issue, especially relevant for not just Muslims in the current global society that we live in, but it's in fact an issue that affects us all. I think if we look at the ramifications of misunderstanding and not doing something constructive about this issue, then I think the consequences and the ramifications affects a global society. So that's why I feel I'm very passionate about this topic, and I'm very excited and thrilled that you've asked me to be a part of this debate and this discussion. So as you've already said, I am Goldsmiths is my home, my second home. I did my PhD at Goldsmiths. My PhD was an ethnographic research study and in-depth examination of the multiple identities of young British-born Bangladeshis from the East End of London. And subsequent to my PhD, I was offered employment there to carry on as a researcher, as an academic, as a thinker, and I've been there ever since. I guess the best way to describe my profession is that I see what I do as a job. I see it as a hobby. I really enjoy what I do. I enjoy the intellectual academic environment that I work within. I enjoy meeting students such as yourselves and others that I can see in the background, who always inspire me and always make me think about something in a different perspective. And I think that keeps me on my toes, and it also allows me to rethink what I already thought I knew, perhaps. Aside from work, I'm a community member, and I use the word community in inverted commas, in the sense that I'm very much part of the East London community from a youth work, voluntary, charity perspective, and I have contributed and have worked for many decades in the third sector voluntary sector. I'm Bangladeshi, and I'm very proud to be a Bangladeshi. I'm also a Muslim. I'm very proud of my Muslim roots. I'm also a very proud Londoner and a very proud British person, whatever that term means. I think I don't put any weight or any hierarchy on any of these identity facets. I think they all define who I am. I was born in Bangladesh and raised in the East End of London, and I think the centrality of who we are, identity, is something that always follows me in all aspects of my work, whether that be in research or the recent media documentary that I did for the BBC. And one final thing I think I should say is that I'm also a trustee at the Royal Greenwich Museums. And the reason why I mention that, because one of my remits in that position is to look specifically and work within the whole area of diversifying the audience of the museum. So making sure that the museum is accessed by everyone and not just a select few. So that's something that I feel it's a challenging role, but it's a very exciting and dynamic one at the same time.
Well, thank you, Aminul. We're very glad to have you here with us and to have such an eminently qualified speaker come in to speak to us on issues of, don't sell yourself short, to come in and speak to us on issues of Islamophobia. I think if I just kind of walk through your life story a little bit to just start to unpick some of the issues we're going to be talking about. So you mentioned that you were born in Bangladesh originally, and then moved to Britain as a child and grew up in East London. And because I noticed you in your introduction to yourself there, you referred to yourself in equal terms as Bangladeshi and as a Londoner, and I'm aware there's obviously an area that's up for debate is increasingly in Britain at the moment is, can you be British and Bangladeshi? Can you be, in my case, can you be English and Norwegian at the same time? And I was wondering what even if you're just talking from about your own personal example, how do you square those kind of different elements of your identity? 'Cause I know you mentioned that you don't really place a premium on either, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that particular.
I think that the project of identity is something that possibly affects us all, and some of us it affects more so than others, and some of us consciously think about this, and some of us unconsciously even play it out on a daily basis. And I think we all play the identity game in many respects, whether that be our gender, our ethnic, our age, our nationality, our religious, our geographic identities. And often we have to make difficult decisions, Sometimes it's a bit more fluid and it's dynamic. And we also change according to the environment, the company that we're in, and also the topic and the nature of debate that we're engaged in at that time. In regards to myself, I think the fact that I was born in Bangladesh is something pretty meaningful to me. It's my motherland, it's the country of my birth. I have a physical as well as a spiritual and an emotional connection with that country. And that will always be there. And that term of endearment, that magical process, that magical sense of belonging will always be there. However, I came here at the age of 3, and all of my life has been here in the UK. And I value this place as my home. This is where my childhood memories are. This is where all of my friends and family are located. So that also contributes to a sense of belonging and a sense of home. And this sense of dual heritage and dual identities, especially for people who are migrants, people who have left another country or another place and have settled elsewhere, is something that we are all grappling with. This conundrum of never quite belonging, never quite being and never quite fitting in somewhere. And often when I go back to Bangladesh, for example, I'm viewed by my relatives over there as a tourist, right? And often in this country, and we're going to talk about this, I suspect, over the course of the next hour, my own British and London identity has become secondary to my own identity as a brown and a Bangladeshi and a Muslim person, which often constructs me as being un-British, right? So these are the political parameters and the political contours in which many people are negotiating their identities, in particular British-born Bangladeshis. So the question with the participants of the subject of my research is, unlike myself, they were born in this country. So their physical connection is to this country, is to London, is to the UK. When they go back to Bangladesh, they see themselves as tourists, let alone be constructed as tourists. So their identity project in question is even more complex and more multi-layered. So yeah, I mean, it's a project. It's something that you can never define, and it's something that's ongoing, and it fluctuates, and it's pretty dynamic.
So that leads us quite nicely into the next question I was going to ask, which is, you mentioned for second-generation immigrants, they don't encounter the same the same argument of, oh, you should go home because, well, we were born here. We we are British. We live here. We've always lived here, and yet they still will face a number of the same discriminatory forces that you might have, despite being born here. And so it's very clear that just the physical location of your birth isn't enough to qualify you as being British, and that there is something about being a Muslim which prevents you from being considered British in the full sense of that. And so to unpack this, I was wondering if we could ask, although it's a very hard term to define, what would you consider Islamophobia? What do you consider to be that decision-making process or that attitude that argues you cannot be simultaneously Muslim and British entirely?
I think that's a really, really powerful and important question, George. I think, and it deserves a multi-layered response. I think what I'm about to say comes from two perspectives. A, from my own personal lived experience as a person who is ethnically diverse, who is brown, who is Bangladeshi. So ethnically, I come from, my origins are from another part of the globe. And also religiously, I represent something which is not very un-British in the context of our discussion. So the lived experience contribute to what I'm about to say, but also my role as a researcher and as an academic, somebody who spent the best part of 2 decades researching and spending time and looking into these matters of diversity, exclusion, alienation, discrimination, racism, and Islamophobia. And I think, interestingly, the term Islamophobia first came into popular usage perhaps in the late 1990s, and it was although it was something that I was hearing in everyday discourse and through the documents that I was reading, it wasn't until the 1997 report by the Runnymede which first brought this into academic as well as policy terminology. And prior to that, interestingly, in my first degree, what you're doing now, 23 odd years ago, in my first degree, I was actually doing my final year dissertation on a gentleman by the name of Osama bin Laden, who we've all come to know subsequently as one of the main thinkers behind the Al-Qaeda movement, which was subsequently held responsible for the 9/11 atrocity in 2001. But I was looking into his underpinning philosophy, his whole life history, his experience in Afghanistan, and the subsequent terror attacks in Africa in the mid 1990s. This was something that I was always interested in, because what I was seeing around me in my own community was that lots of my previously Bangladeshi community members were becoming Islamic. So there was being a shift in the way they were identified themselves, and also the way they wanted others to identify them with. So there was a journey from an ethnic to a religious community, and that was happening. And I was asking myself, as well as researching, why was this happening? What was going on here? And what became apparent to me is that global events, especially political events regarding what was happening in Afghanistan during that time, and a few years prior in Iraq, and arguably the 1989 was a shift, was an important year in when there was an ideological shift. If we see the ending of the coming down of the Berlin Wall, the ending of the Cold War, and the emergence of perhaps a new world order, where you see perhaps a new enemy, because what the West, our country in particular, and the USA, what the politics, how it normally has worked over the course of a 200-year period, is that it's always trying to define itself against an other. Right? Whether it was Nazi Germany in the early part of this century, whether it was then the communist threat emanating from Russia and China in the mid, and arguably since 1989, you see a new Islamic Arab threat that's emerged. And you only have to look at all the interventions and wars in the last 20 or 30 odd years to see Somalia, Syria, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan. You just see that it usually involves Muslim nations. So there's something very political happening within in a very local community that was happening across the globe. And cynically also, if you think about perhaps another important event in the UK context, the burning of the Satanic Verses, Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses in 1989, that was perhaps one of the first episodes in this country where you saw a visible reaction from a community that was angered by something that was said or proclaimed about something they hold dear and precious to them, their religion. Right? So you saw street protests, you saw the burning of the books, and what happened in that very moment was this community that has been here for many decades, that has always been constructed and viewed as being very hardworking, peaceful, law-abiding. Overnight, it became a troubled community that was synonymous with violence, street riots, barbaric. These people live a different life, they have different values, different ideologies. So there was all of these overlapping narratives that was happening over that period. And I was just fascinated and interested as to what was happening. And to answer your question in a very long way, in terms of defining Islamophobia, I think that's really, so what is Islamophobia? So if you think about phonetically and physically, Islam is a global religion that's got over, say, 1.6 billion people. And what's a phobia? That's something that we hold apprehension towards. We're scared, we're afraid of it. We don't quite understand it. So if you put it together, effectively, that's what it denotes. It's when people don't understand a religion, when people are scared and have a fear and perhaps an unnatural fear and dread of a religion and the people that follow the religion. And that's what's emerged and overtaken people's psyches and the way people represent and see Muslims over the course of the past 2 odd decades.
Thank you. This is a very interesting historiography you raised there. I think the point you made about the need for a new enemy and a new other after the fall of the Soviet Union, I think it's very neatly reflected if you watch action movies of the era, where the villains throughout the 70s and 80s were always Russians, and then they suddenly became Middle Eastern, white actors pretending to be Middle Eastern characters suddenly then in the 90s and noughties.
It's interesting, right? Hollywood movies, if you think about even prior to that, the movies in the 70s, the enemies were Vietnamese, right? So Hollywood, there is a weird, warped, close interrelationship between Hollywood and real life and politics, dare I say, and it often reflects what you've just said.
And so you kind of create this chicken egg situation where the films being made reflect the political attitudes of the times, and the political attitudes then are reinforced by the movies. And so the question becomes, how do you eventually break that cycle? Well, knock down the Berlin Wall. In the case of Islam, we've not yet. In the case of Islamophobia, we've not yet come to that point. I'm also particularly interested in the idea you raised of kind of the intersection. So Islam as a religion also intersects, if we're talking about Islamophobia, with racist attitudes. You mentioned that it's not just the fact that you are Muslim, but the fact you're also a person of color, and that white Muslims will experience Islamophobia differently. It ties in with xenophobic attitudes, that it's being a British Muslim is different if you were a Muslim coming from somewhere in the Middle East, which has a huge amount of kind of political baggage, given the last few years last few decades rather, of global politics. Any more thoughts you'd like to share just on that kind of intersectionality question?
I mean, it's really curious as to why our government, our present government, is taking such an age to come to a consensus or a legal definition, or even a recognition that Islamophobia is a lived experience by many millions of people, not just in this country, but across the world. There's so much debate, there's so much, even though there was an all-party parliamentary definition put forward last year, 2009, which was rejected, which argued that Islamophobia is like a dislike of Muslims and people associated with the religion. And it's also an unnatural dislike. And the problematic element behind this is a bit like institutionalized racism. It becomes so unnatural that it's become natural, that people are not even aware that they're being prejudiced or discriminatory towards Muslim people who are overtly and spiritually Muslim. So the link to racism is a really interesting one, and I think that's something that we should try and unpack a bit more. And one of the key people that I think helps us understand this more is an American scholar by the name of Edward Said, who looked at the history of how the West, when they explored the world, when they went to other parts of the world, the imageries, the stories, the relationships, the unequal power relationships they had with these other people, and also the stories they brought back. And one of the key ideas that they brought back were that these people who live in other parts of the world, whether that be South America, Asia, Africa, these people are barbaric, they're backwards, they need some form of authority, they need some form of governance, they don't have the ability to govern themselves. And also there was this idea of a very Christian focused ideological drive of manifest destiny, that we are the chosen people and we've been given a God-given right to almost rule over these people who need ruling. We are the people that should civilize them. So this old colonial imperialist approach and attitude is something that's intrinsic in the way racism operates. And in many respects, this is exactly what's happened with Islamophobia. So Islamophobia and people being on the end of Islamophobic acts and actions, it's the similar. You have the exact same feelings as if you were on the end of a racist action. If you're discriminated against, there's a huge sense of prejudice. There are a huge sense of misinformed stereotypes, and also the gaze, the critical gaze, just the way people look at you, right? So many people in this country, many Muslims, the 2.7 odd Muslims in this country, overwhelmingly have many intersections that they need to overcome, many hurdles. One is social class. Overwhelmingly, the majority of Muslims also happen to be working class background. Overwhelmingly, the majority of Muslims come from different parts of the world and have a different skin complexion. And overwhelmingly, many Muslims express their religion. So they are overtly Muslim, whether they wear the headscarf, whether they wear traditional clothing, whether they have a beard, whether they pray. So there are physical markers that make them to be different. So this is how racism operates. That it operates on this curious conundrum between a phobia of people that you don't quite understand, but also they are different, right? They eat different food, they pray to a different God, they wear different clothes, they smell different, they look different. So this politics of difference emerges and intertwines in with how Islamophobia and also racism operates. And the key thing that emerges from all of this is the really horrible and problematic discourse that we hear many of our media politicians and media journalists, broadcasters and politicians use, this them versus us rhetoric. This is what they do, this is what we do, right? This is their way of life and this is our way of life. And that rhetoric is really divisive and fans the flames of what Islamophobia essentially is.
And the us versus them, I suppose, coming back to what you've pointed, the centuries-old Orientalist viewpoint of this, the white European Christian savior, that these are people who are in some way inferior in culture or in civilization. There's some need to uplift them. I think you touched on it briefly, but I think possibly one of the best examples of this potentially being the debate around the hijab and with head coverings. And in this us versus them dialogue, it's often discussed within right-wing media as it being an oppressive tool used to subjugate women within Islamic communities, and that you look at the French government, for example, with their bans on certain forms of religious dress, and that this is about women's empowerment and liberation. So it's all couched in progressive language, and it's about help saving Muslims from themselves, essentially. And I know you've done research in this area on kind of Islamic feminism, but that's it's just a construction.
Yeah, I mean, this and women in the Muslim communities across the globe seem to bear the brunt of lots of Islamophobic physical as well as verbal abuse, because they are often the biggest identifiers because of the choice of clothing, right? And this stick to beat the Muslim communities, not just the community, because it's also a fallacy to talk about this monolithic, uniform Muslim community. It's more useful and correct, I would say, to talk about communities that differ. We're not all one community. There's difference in caste, social class, geography, nation, language, religiosity. Some of us practice the religion far more than others. Some of us are just part-timers. Some of us are just nominal Muslims. There's so much diversity even within the UK British Muslim community. But this stick that normally is used to beat the Muslim communities with is the notion of like the women are treated inferior, subservient, they're second-class citizens, that the dress code is enforced upon them. In many respects, if you take away the term Muslim away from woman, I think, unfortunately, this is a struggle for women across the globe, right? Patriarchy and subservience of women, unfortunately, historically, and even in contemporary society, is something that most women are struggling with. But in my own experience, having spoken to many younger British-born Muslim females, they're anything but those colonial, problematic Orientalist constructions and representations that you alluded to earlier. These girls are vibrant, confident, articulate, independent, autonomous, and they are not, and they are also struggling and challenging and pushing the boundaries and shaping and molding what patriarchy means to them, right? So this is a global issue. This is a national issue. This is not just a Muslim issue, right? And the other thing I would say, George, is and I wrote this down interestingly, is the older colonial representations of Muslims as being barbaric, as being irrational, as being violent, as being what hasn't helped is we've obviously, unfortunately, seen a spat of violent and terroristic events happening in our country and across the globe. So to list, we saw the Satanic Verse Rushdie Street riots. We saw, of course, 9/11, which was a game changer in terms of a shift as to how Islamophobia has affected people. We saw the 2011 and 2001 and 2 street riots. We saw the London bombings of 2005. We saw the Madrid bombings, the French riots, the Danish cartoon protests, the brutal murder of Lee Rigby in 2013, the Charlie Hebdo murders of 2015, the Syrian British-born people being involved in the Syrian conflict, to name but a few, right? The list goes on. And I think these events, these terror criminal events, these are not Muslims in my perspective, and to many hundreds and thousands of people that I know in the Muslim community, we absolutely condemn these actions. These are not, they're not doing it in our name. These are criminal terrorist acts, yet they've become synonymized with Islam, the spiritual, peaceful religion that I know, that I grew up with. And that's also problematic. And that fans the flames of right-wing, particularly right-wing and mainstream Islamophobia.
And that, going back to what you said previously about the conception of Islam as a hegemonic bloc, and that, as you say, there are communities rather than a singular community. It's not, as a number of right-wingers would suggest, that all Muslims are in one big WhatsApp group together, all plotting the next terrorist attack. And the conflation of the conflation of extreme Islamic fundamentalist groups with being representative of the movement as of the population as a whole.
There's so much diversity. I mean, forget about going far. Even in my own household, my younger sister wears the headscarf, my older sister doesn't. My wife doesn't wear the headscarf, my younger brother's wife does, right? Some of us take a very politicized, passionate view of the Arab-Israeli conflict, what's going on there. Some of us don't even care, we don't even talk about it, right? So forget about the wider community, just within a microcosm of my personal home, you can see the diversity that exists.
And so I suppose as you say, this is one of the big drivers. We're looking at the 21st century, the 9/11, the aftermath of 9/11 and the world we live in at the moment, that the fear of jihad and of Islamic terrorism is one of the big drivers of Islamophobia in the West and within the right wing. I suppose what I wanted to ask is, when we consider Islamophobia, I'm sure a lot of people coming into this call this evening was, if you're asked to picture an Islamophobe, you probably picture someone taking part in an EDL march. You picture someone who's out on the streets protesting to send them home. I was wondering, obviously, as with any form of discrimination, it's more multi-layered than that. It's not always the in-your-face beatings of Muslims on the streets. There are far more kind of insidious ways that Islamophobia manifests itself. And what do you think are some of those ways that are worthwhile kind of highlighting for people who are listening here today? What are the things we should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, I mean, that once again, that's a really, really important question. And I'm going to give you a two-layered response to that. Firstly, I think it doesn't also help that some of our absolutely senior political leaders at the highest level say things which are really unproductive, which are problematic, and which fan the flames of this discrimination towards this global community. So, for example, we saw what Jack Straw said in 2006 when he didn't want to speak to some of his constituents who decided to wear the burqa. We saw recently our own Prime Minister in 2018 referring to Muslim women as bank robbers and letterboxes. And we saw in the immediacy of after these comments, we saw that there was a 375% increase in Islamophobic race hate attacks. We've seen that over the last decade, the anti-Muslim bigotry emanating from the United States, and in particular Donald Trump and his tweets. We see the very problematic language of London and Bradford being referred to as Bradistan and Londonistan by some of the right-wing papers. We see the Trojan horse takeover in Birmingham because some politicians were afraid that Muslims were taking over the schools. So we see this continuous feeling, political scaremongering threat that these Muslims are they're so hell-bent on taking over everything. They're so hell-bent on changing the way we live our lives. And we see politicians and academics in Europe in particular use language like because of the immigration and because of youth demographics, Islam is going to take over Europe, right? Over the next decade, these people, just like they tried to do historically with the Ottoman and other empires in the contemporary society, Islam is here and they're going to take over. And we saw similar language used by Margaret Thatcher in 1978, when she used the language of swamping, referring to the immigration debate, that immigrants coming into this country, the metaphor and the imagery that this connotes to people, right? The scaremongering, the moral panic that people subsequently getting engaged in, as these people are here to take over. So it doesn't help that you have people at the highest level, people in positions of authority and power, saying and insinuating such imageries. And in regards to whether the experience of Islamophobia is implicit and explicit, of course, you see myself, for example, all my life I've been called names, right? Whether that be smelly, and I wrote some of these down earlier, greasehead, fish, bongo, packy, black, terrorists, and it's exemplified by the repeated experience of something you said earlier: you don't belong here, go back to where you come from, right? This is something that I've heard all of my life, I've grown up with, and now younger Muslims who are overtly practicing and expressing their faith through their spirituality and through their dress are hearing this in droves. So you hear of attacks in mosques, you hear of people being spat on, hear of people getting beaten up, you hear people being called Osama or Muhammad, go back to where you come from. These representation and these labelings are really problematic. And then you hear of like horrible, horrific events, which the extreme manifestation of it. So you see of the massacre in Christchurch, New Zealand last year. The Anders Breivik in Norway in 2011 was also governed and inspired on an anti-Islamic agenda, and we know 77 people, innocent people, subsequently lost their lives. So, so you hear of everyday low-level abuse, which may seem on the surface as being small, but believe you me, it's extremely discriminatory and and it makes you feel like somewhat different. It makes you feel second class, and it makes you feel less than what you actually are. That's what Islamophobia and racism makes you feel. It makes you feel less than what you actually are, a second class, less worthy citizen and a human being. And then you see the extreme manifestations of like mass massacres in mosques and what happened in Norway. And then you saw, I think it was last year or the year before, when there was a drive, when in Finsbury Park, North London, when he was once again governed by an extreme anti-Muslim agenda. So it happens, like you said, insidiously, it happens implicitly, and also explicitly. And just one final example is the everyday lived experience is, of course, the airport experience, which I've shared with many of my students. Myself, I'm fortunate enough to have been able to travel and see many parts of the world, whether in a work or in a tourist social basis, and near enough, myself and my family near enough always get stopped for that random search at the airports, right? So this is the insidious, implicit consequences of Islamophobia. My name, they suggest, they always argue, whenever they type in my name in the airport authorities, it flags up something. Therefore, they need to take me into a separate room and put me through additional questioning. So this feeling of feeling othered, feeling different, feeling second class is something that emanates from everyday Islamophobic lived experiences.
First of all, just to quickly thank you for sharing a number of the personal examples there, which I'm just taking a moment to kind of recover from some of the power of what you said there. I was wondering, as you mentioned a number of the issues you mentioned in terms of the discrimination, the invasion narrative around immigration, there's obviously a lot of overlap with other forms of discrimination. There are other forms of religious discrimination. There are other forms of anti-immigrant sentiment. And I was wondering, were there any ideas you wanted to raise about what is often unique about Islamophobia? How would you compare the anti-immigrant rhetoric to countries such as, say, Bangladesh, Pakistan, if you compare it to other Eastern European nations? So Farage's favorite examples of Romania and Hungary. What do you see as being different in those forms of discrimination?
I think there are differences, but there are perhaps more overlaps. There are more intersections, and one of the key intersection is this continuous feeling of being othered, right? So if you think about how discrimination, whether that be from a gendered, from an ethnic, from a racial, from a national, from a linguistic, from a religious perspective occurs, some of the commonalities that differentiate us from them from us, operates on three levels. Firstly, the ideological difference, right? These people, or this set of people, these groups of people, think, behave differently to us. They have different ideas, they have different values, they are not like us. Secondly, physically, right? So they don't just think differently to us, but they also look differently to us. They dress differently to us. They have different values, they speak a different language. Some of them can't even be bothered to speak English. That's how much they're not part of our society. And thirdly, overwhelmingly, if you think about the narrative that has been forced overwhelmingly towards the British Muslim community over the past 30 odd years, I would argue, if you think about all of the issues that Muslims have become synonymous with, unfortunately, I can name you some, and overwhelmingly they're all negative. I challenge you to find a positive story. Overwhelmingly, if you think about the political and media narrative, it's around violence. It's around female genital mutilation, FGM. It's around forced marriages. It's around sexual grooming. It's around patriarchal practices, terrorism, welfare cheats, irrationality, criminality. The list goes on, right? So this is the representation and the construction of the Muslim community. It's around all these negativities. And what's happened as a result, and Martin Barker, the Marxist Martin Barker talks about this. He talks about this departure for some communities where they are now experiencing a new form of cultural racism, which exists on the markers of difference, as opposed to the old forms, which were more physical differences based on skin color. So the new ones are far more subtle, they're harder to detect. And it's this idea that these people, it's not that we're racist, but these people just are a bit different to us. And I don't quite understand why they do that, right? So, and it's guised usually under liberal intellectual discourse, but when you unpack it, actually it's very divisive and very problematic.
And I suppose one of the common lines you hear a lot is about the quote, "They don't integrate." It's about there being isolated immigrant communities that don't, assimilate with the majority culture of the nation that they've moved to, and that's the main issue. Is that, well, as you said, that they don't speak our language, they don't engage with us, and though you can obviously understand, why would they, in the face of such, abuse and discrimination they receive, you can kind of understand why these people wouldn't want to engage in the face of that.
And this is also a global question, right? If you look at the history of migration and immigration and settlement, this is a question not just affecting UK Muslim communities, but it's affecting communities all across the globe, whether that be the Algerians in Paris, in France, the Moroccans in Belgium, the Turks in Germany, the Italians in some communities in America, in the earlier part of this century. This is a global phenomenon, right? This is a global migrant story. This is not just something limited to British Muslim communities.
You mentioning another, a set of different countries. I was actually going to ask your thoughts on this. How do you see Islamophobia potentially manifesting itself differently in the United Kingdom, if we're going to talk about this country specifically, in comparison to other countries? How do you think we measure up to other nations in terms of, the lived experience for Muslims and the way that the government tackles it and the kinds of attitudes and narratives you see? Is there anything that makes us special in either a positive or negative way?
No, I think there are many parallels and overlaps between our experience here and our European brothers and sisters and our European neighbours. I think if you look at all the evidence and all the research conducted in countries like Italy, France in particular, Belgium, you see there is a lot of resentment and a lot of hostility towards Muslim communities over there. Some national survey attitudes always nearly reveal that people in general will feel bothered, quote unquote, if a mosque was to be built in their neighborhood, right? People always are scaremongered also into believing that immigration and Muslims are here to take over Europe. Of course, the earlier narrative, if you look at all the historical empires, if you look at what the Ottoman Empire did and nearly did, they came all the way to Spain. So there's historical precedents there to reinforce modern day scaremongering. If you look at all the attacks in France in the last decade, the continuous attacks towards Muslim communities, and also the unfortunate terrorist attacks that's also happening in that country. So that's gone hand in hand. I think this issue is really worrying and is really problematic. And unfortunately, it's not on the decline. If anything, it's on the rise. And then you see, in France in particular, we know France is his own set of politics and own set of Republican issues regarding secularism, and we know the role of religion within such a polity. And many Muslims who are expressing their religion in publicly are finding that very difficult to cope with. So once again, the issue of social class, issue of racism, and the issue of exclusion, right, is something that is endemic and parallel and affects all Muslims, regardless of whether you're in France, Britain, Germany, or other countries. And the other interesting parallel is that most Muslims in these countries have undergone many journeys, right? So from a spiritual, religious to a political community, from a community that was on the periphery, now wanting to become part of the core, right? They're demanding action, they want recognition, they want a voice, and they want social justice. From invisibility to visibility, all of a sudden, Muslims dominate the media and political agenda. From passivity to politics of recognition. From peace-loving neighbors to a global threat. From hardworking citizens to extreme radicals. And in my case, from an immigrant to a citizen to an immigrant. And also from a Paki to Osama. Now that's also a really relevant quote there, because once upon a time I was just seen as a South Asian. I was seen as a Bangladeshi. Now the discrimination I experience is also because of my religion. This journey from a Paki, Aminul, to Osama, right? This journey from culture, ethnicity to religion, right? But the feelings of discrimination and exclusion and feeling less worthy and second-class citizenship is something that's always remained regardless of these journeys.
Just listening to your first part of that response, I can't help but notice kind of the irony of it being former colonial powers like Britain and France that are now the most terrified of foreign invasion, with different peoples coming over imposing certain religious and cultural values on them. There's I think looking at it in the picture of kind of a broader historical scope, that there's just some level of irony at play there.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, I wrote this quote down here about some political leaders talking about how dare these immigrants or these people from other parts of the world come to this country, and how dare they want to change the names of our streets, how dare they want to build mosques, how dare they want to build gurdwaras, etc. How would they like it if we went to their country and did the same? And the irony can't be missed there, right?
Yeah, well, it's I think, as you point to, not something that's going away quickly. As you mentioned, in the kind of growing, well, the concerning trend that this is on the up rather than on the decline. We thought, as we move further away from 9/11, potentially we start to get over some of the cultural fears that we're seeing. But with the rise of Brexit and Trump and the populist movements all over Europe and the Western world, this isn't going away. And so I suppose the kind of final question I'd like to pitch to you before we start moving towards opening the floor to the audience for any of their questions is trying to end this on a slightly more positive note. Kind of, what do you see as being some of the steps that we can take as individuals or as a society? What do you think are some of the things that need to happen for Islamophobia to start to be shown the door?
Yeah, I'm glad you allowed me to end on a positive note, George, because I think I do want to, and I've spoken about lots of negativities in the past, because it is a lived experience, and unfortunately, overwhelmingly, it is a negative experience. However, there are some practical and ideological and emotional steps, positive steps that we can take to perhaps tackle Islamophobia and show it up for what it is. One is the personal and emotional. So this goes to everyone who's Muslim and non-Muslim. I think, and this was the main message from my documentary earlier this year, is to be proud of who you are. Be proud of where you come from. Be proud of your background, your heritage, your ancestry, your roots. Don't let others get in the way of you feeling proud of your ancestry. Embrace your dual and multifaceted identity. Embrace who you are. Embrace the many elements that you're a part of. And also, secondly, the other point is this idea that there is this idea of a universal truth, that there's only one story. Of course, we know that there are 7 odd billion people around the world, and there are multiple truths. We all have stories to say, and we all have stories to share, right? So do that, share your story, share your background, and educate other people who may not understand you or who may have this fear and dread of you. The other thing is positive role modeling. So let's think about the contributions that Muslims are currently making and historically we have made. So earlier I spoke about the negative storylines that Muslims are always synonymous with, but rarely do we hear any positive stories. So Think about the many prominent British Muslims who form a major part of our everyday life in the year 2020, from in the politics, culture, arts, academia, medicine, etc. Nadia Hussain, Sadiq Khan, our mayor, Sermo Farah, Zayn Malik. My children are One Direction fans, hence I know this. Asad Ahmed, the BBC One news reporter, Riz Hussain, a brilliant actor, Baroness Wasi, who is really taking the agenda of Islamophobia into political parlance. And if you think about, I mean, did you know, for example, George, and my children reminded me of this, is that did you know some key Muslim inventions that have shaped the world we live in today? If I was to tell you that coffee was first brewed in Yemen in the 9th century, if I was to tell you that the idea of universities comes from Morocco, if I was to tell you that algebra, mathematics, was invented by a Muslim, if I was to tell you that the idea of hospitals comes from Egypt, and also the camera, optics, was invented by a Muslim, if I was to tell you that all the positive contributions that Muslims have made in the world, right, would that surprise you? Would that surprise some of our listeners? It surprises me because I never heard of this until my children told me about this, because they researched. And this comes to my next point about education, another step way forward. We need to reform the educational curriculum. In light of the wider hashtag Black Lives Matters movement, we need to hear more stories, more histories, more narratives from other parts of the world. We need to value non-white voices and non-white identities, right? Give them. So we need to reshape and change the curriculum to be more reflexive, more inclusive, and more diverse. And the final point I would like to leave you with is this. I think that the question of whether you can be Muslim and British, whether you need to make a choice, you can't be both. That these two facets of identity are diametrically and ideologically opposed. That is also problematic, and it was brought into political discussion in the early noughties. I think that we need to reformulate. We need to unproblematize this problem, and we need to say, we need to ask the question, absolutely, we can be both, and we can be proud of both of our identities, because there are many overlaps. And to be a Muslim is to also be British, right? So Britishness needs to be more inclusive and more diverse, and it needs to include the many other voices and histories and cultures of people from across the globe.
It's a good three-step plan there for hopefully moving us in the direction that we'd want to be going. What I'm going to do now is, everyone's been listening very patiently and very intently. I'm going to start to now open up the floor for discussion from our audience. So if anyone, just to make this work in the online format, I'm going to ask if anyone has a question that they would like to ask, or anything they'd like to contribute to the discussion. If you could just, in the chat here in the Zoom call, just say, I have a question, or just words to that effect. And then what I can do is I can call on people one by one to unmute themselves and ask that question, and we can further the discussion for the next 20 to 30 minutes based on the kinds of questions or issues that you guys would like to raise. So any thoughts, any ideas anyone has, just make a note of that in the chat. And I'm sure Aminul will have lots to say on whatever it is that you would like to hear a little bit more discussion on. So if anyone's got any thoughts, just chuck them in the chat, or just let us know. I'm seeing we also had Amy shared some thoughts in the chat as well, just while people are formulating their questions. So she's saying, Aminul, that she completely agrees with your point about diversifying the curriculum. And so on that note, I suppose this is already our first question. Amy would like to hear a bit more about the work you've been doing with diversifying accessibility at the Greenwich Museums. So you talked right at the beginning when you're introducing yourself about how you've been working to try and diversify the audience at the Royal Museums in Greenwich. Yeah, so from Amy's question then, is there any more information you can share about that and the work you've been doing?
Yeah, so museum education, it's challenging, but also it's an opportunity. So if we think about the role of especially British museums, we know, loose quotes, we know that museums are the custodians of British history, heritage, and culture, right? And if you think about the recent 200-300 year history of Britain, we know that it's steeped in colonial expansion across the globe. And museums, in effect, tell the story of this, right? The colonial expansion, what Britain has contributed to the world. And what I've asked in boardroom meetings is, it's great we ask that question, but can we also hear the other story, the other side? So it goes back to this idea of multiple stories. Can we view one episode or epoch of history from an alternative and a different perspective, right? And this is a challenge because it's not something that sits easy with lots of people in the museum industry, but also there is a vigor and a huge energy within the museum sector to retell existing stories, to give different opinions, different aspects of one story. So that's something that I'm involved in. The other element of diversifying the audience of the museum is that I want all the museums to be, I remember as a child, I used to go to the Museum of Childhood in Bethnal Green all of the time because it was our local museum. And I just remember it, I remember many hours as a major part of my childhood, just having fun. And I want museums to regain that element of fun, of being interactive, of being educative. But also museums need to regain a sense of local identity. So if you think about the Royal Greenwich Museum, which is situated in one of the most diverse parts of London, of the UK, yet our audience does not reflect the local community. So I've asked, and we're working on an outreach program which takes the museum's work into these communities, works with them, engages with them, allows them to have a voice, allows them to have a sense of ownership, and then ultimately we hope that they can see that the museum is part of who they are and part of the community. So these are just two of the very big complex projects that I'm involved in.
And projects, I'm sure, which are very much an ongoing process and will be for quite some time. So thank you very much, Amy, for that question. And if anyone else has any more questions, feel free to either type it out in the chat, or if you'd rather not type it all out, just again put "I have a question," and then we can allow you to just unmute yourself and ask. In the meantime, we have had another question come through, a question from Samaya, which I'll just read out for you, Aminul. So she would like to ask whether you think, if we're looking just at current events, whether you think it's fair that the current COVID restrictions that we have been relaxed over the Christmas period now, giving giving people who celebrate Christmas the opportunity to do so. But given that a few months previously, Muslims earlier this year were not able to, I think it was the day before they found out that the government was increasing restrictions. What any kind of thoughts on that? And I think it's fairly obviously unfair, but just any thoughts to share on that policy decision?
Yeah, I mean, look, let's face it, right? There is an ingrained problem here in the sense that this country, as does many countries across Europe, they claim to be a secular polity, that there's a clear division between the church and politics, the church and the state. Whereas we know that most of our everyday practices, our cultures, our Easter holidays, Christmas holidays, the overwhelming disproportionate funding of Church of England schools at state level as opposed to other faith schools, the biblical references often our politicians use in everyday political speak. We know that there is this complex intermarriage between politics and religion. And this country overwhelmingly is a Christian country. So to say that this country is not a religious country, or that secularism is something that is an aspiration, which it is, but whether it works in reality, that also is something which is open to debate. In regards to the question regarding COVID and the upcoming Christmas period, do I agree with it? I think I'm going to sound like Nick Hancock and Boris here when I say I'm going to be guided by the science here, because that's all I can be guided by. And if the scientists are saying that it is a safe time for people to relax some of the restrictions, then perhaps we go with it. But I can't also help cynically think, but by thinking that it's also a time, Christmas, what does it symbolize? Take the religion away from it, what does it symbolize? Whether you're Christian or not, what does it symbolize? It symbolizes a time where families get together, where people take some time out from their everyday lives and just eat, sit at home, socialize, be with loved ones, go on a journey back to their home counties, So it's a symbol of eating, togetherness, etc. And where you just take some time out and just relax and recharge your batteries. I think in that respect, from a social and cultural element, Christmas has become more of a cultural fact of life as opposed to a religious way of life. I think we celebrate Christmas, and I'm not Christian, right? I don't celebrate it in a religious sense. I celebrate it for all of those other factors. It's an opportunity for me to meet loved ones, get together, and just eat. But in regards to was it Sumaya? Sumaya, I think, what her question. Yeah. What was it unfair that Muslims and other religious rituals and occurrences, they weren't allowed to congregate and get together? Well, I've kind of answered that in the first part. There is an overwhelming bias, and I guess towards Christian-led activities as opposed to other activities and other rituals and other communities in this country. And perhaps this speaks to the wider imbalance and disproportionality that's given towards Christianity and perhaps other faiths in this country.
And this going back to what you said earlier in our discussion about what is considered normal, what is considered other. Christmas as a celebration is not even considered to be Christian. It's just the norm. It's just everyone celebrates Christmas, and then Eid and other religious celebrations are the special ones.
Yeah, that's what other people, that's not what we do, that's what other people do. And this feeds into the narrative of Islamophobia, the narrative of difference. And also, let's also not forget the economic argument behind Christmas as well, right? The opening of pubs, restaurants. Let's not forget how much the pound sign, the economics, is driving and in many respects superseding and overriding the science behind the COVID figures that we're seeing.
Yeah, definitely. And we've had a couple of other questions come through. So we've had one typed out question, and I'll just go with the order in which they've been asked, just for the sake of fairness. So Pippa said that she has a question, so I'll hand over Pippa now, if you'd like to just ask that to Aminul.
Hiya. I just wanted to ask about, obviously, your experience that you've had with, obviously, the nicknames that you've been called and things. I just wanted to ask that, obviously, your daughters have grown up in a newer time, and I'm just wondering what their experiences are in terms of what other people might have said to them, to their face or behind their back, and how you've dealt with that as a parent.
Really fascinating question, and I'm happy to engage with this. I mean, I'm very keen to install a sense of heritage, ancestry, and roots with my children. Hence, one of the key drivers behind doing a documentary with the BBC. A part of it was going back on that visit to Bangladesh with my daughters, and it was magical for them to feel the sense of connection with a place that they've never been to before, that they weren't born in. Britain and London is their home. These girls are ferociously British, they're ferociously London, and I guess they pick up on more subtle cues of difference, which is less around name calling, because thankfully I live in a very, very tolerant, multicultural part of London, where you have people from all parts of the world living in a small borough. But every day, these insidious examples of, for example, I think I've shared this with some of my students in the class, where my eldest daughter went to school one day and she likes the biryani. The biryani is like a very flavored, very, very, very delicious, but also very pungent rice that many people from the South Asian continent have. And we gave her this as part of her packed lunch. And she took it to school, and one of her 5-year-old friends said to her, "Ew, that thing is disgusting, it smells." And from that day on, she flat blank refused for us to allow her to take biryani into schools again. Even though it's very much part of a cultural staple diet, everyday diet that many South Asians and Bangladeshis eat. She has it at home. She makes that distinction between what she's at home and what she's outside. But what it did say to her, what it did tell her inadvertently, is that this is a part of her difference, that she's somehow different. She somehow associated her cultural dish with somehow feeling subservient and feeling different. Now, this wasn't the intention of the other 5-year-old child. I'm sure it wasn't. But these are everyday examples which kind of reminds these girls that they are different. And because perhaps I'm a political animal, and because that rubs off on these girls, they were equally mortified in 2016 when Donald Trump won the American election over Hillary Clinton. And the eldest actually stayed awake for most of the night because she wanted to see what was happening in America. And the following morning, she was left aghast because what she said is, Dad, here is an open man who doesn't like Muslims, who is very racist, who's mocked disabled people, who doesn't like women as well, is very sexist, and people still voted for him. Right? And I can see in that moment that she started seeing herself. Then she said, I'm a woman, I'm a Muslim, and I'm also brown. I don't want to go, I ever want to go to that country, Dad. Right? So this sense of racism and difference is playing out in different ways amongst the younger generation, but it's still there, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Again, some very powerful personal examples there, and thank you very much for sharing. So we've had a question from Claire, which I'll read out for your benefit. So this question is regarding the government's Prevent scheme, one which I have a number of thoughts on as well, through a couple of students that I've worked with. My teaching and volunteering work have been picked up by Prevent. Aminul, her question is around whether you think that Prevent and other counterterrorism strategies, she's put in quotes, the impact you think that they have on Muslim students and their ability to engage with their studies and extracurricular activities. And what do you think the educational establishment should do, particularly in terms of higher education, to try and stop students from feeling targeted in that kind of way?
Thank you, Claire, for that question. In 2015, I wrote an article for the Conversation, and I'm just trying to find one of the key quotes from that article I wrote was that the policy of Prevent is problematic because, quote unquote, it instills this suspect surveillance culture and almost legitimizes and legalizes Islamophobia. Because we've seen that the disproportionate, even though the rhetoric is to counter extremism and fundamentalism in all walks of life, that we've seen that most of the people who've been referred as part of the Prevent scheme have disproportionately come from Muslim communities. It has contributed to this ongoing old school Orientalist mentality of them versus us, this moral panic, this moral panic between the British us and the Muslim other, right? That some of these people are just hold barbaric, archaic, violent values. And we've seen in its most comical sense, the child who wrote about he lives in a terraced house, but couldn't pronounce it properly, and therefore the teacher thought he said a terrorist house. We've seen it play out in awful ways in our schooling institutions. What is the role of education? The role of education is to inspire our students. The role of education is to motivate our students. The role of education, whether that's primary, secondary, or university, is to allow students to find themselves and also contribute to debate, to not be scared or worried about whatever they say, whether that's going to be surveyed by their teachers and also reported subsequently. And also, what are we asking our teachers to do? They're not spies, they're teachers. They're there to teach, they're there to motivate, they're there to change lives. They're not there to spy on these young people, these young children. And also vis-a-vis, by doing that, what you are doing is you are once again generalizing a whole community, that perhaps something about what they are and who they are is problematic, and therefore our government telling us to do it is the correct thing to do. And it puts some teachers in a really difficult predicament. So I've got, like yourself, like Claire, I suspect, I've got my reservations and hesitations about this really problematic policy of Prevent. I
honestly can't agree more. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to let us know in the chat. And I think, Aminul, you mentioned earlier, actually, when we were talking about the kinds of attacks that people face, that a huge number of attacks are not by Muslims, rather on or against Muslims or Muslim-affiliated groups. I think the Norwegian example obviously stands out to me, Anders Breivik and his mass shooting. And it's white Christian people like him who would not be reported to Prevent. The Prevent scheme would not encourage people to look out for white supremacists. It's couched entirely around language about what is against British values. That's, I suppose, another more kind of problematic government policy, this idea of British values, again, this otherization and what is the normal and what is different.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know that in many parts of the world, in America in particular, that one of the threats that they experience mainly comes, it's indigenous, it's domestic, and it usually comes from far-right groups. Yet the narrative around the Muslim other, the terrorist other, the barbaric Muslim other, and often false media reports immediately after terrorist events always describes an Arab brown-looking man with a beard was seen leaving the scene of terror, right? It's this scaremongering, this precipitation, this stereotyping, this vastly misguided discrimination, which is hugely problematic and contributes to the wider discourse. And I think time after time, report after report, British Muslims have been viewed as the perpetrators of their own misfortunes, right? They're poor because they're too lazy. They don't want to work, therefore they don't want to earn money. They don't get the right grades because they don't work hard enough at school. Or they go on summer holidays to Pakistan or Bangladesh or India, and they don't value British education, they just stay there. They're not integrated because, like you said, they don't speak the language. Time after time, historical reports, the Denham report, the Cantor report of the early noughties, recent reports, always the Swan report of 1985, it blames the victim. It blames the victim for their own misfortune. Important issues in the meantime, such as institutional racism, poverty, class, educational inequalities, racism, Islamophobia, and how all these works, these appear to be ignored altogether. These wider structural issues, systemic issues, is where the energy and resources should lie. This is where we should be. This is this is not the solution, but this is where the problem of this discrimination arises from both ends, right? This is where the energy, the money, the education, the policy needs to be concentrated in.
Yeah. Excellent. Do we have any final questions from anyone? I'm keen to make sure that no one is left leaving today having not gotten the opportunity to ask a question they would like to get out. So final call for anyone who has anything they'd like to add to the conversation. Just make a quick note in the chat and let us know. Simon's been tempted by the offer. Simon, a quick question from Simon. Simon, feel free to unmute yourself and ask Aminul.
Hello, mate. Yeah, you're right. I had a fair few things I wanted to say, but they were all too long to try and truncate into a decent question. Aminul, I guess from your experience, which is far more extensive than mine, I wondered what disparity there is in the perception and acts of Islamophobia across the UK. So, of course, we come from Tower Hamlets, and there's a huge Islamic community which we're more used to, and so there's a visibility there, and there's something. Well, for me personally, anyway, there's something comforting about knowing people from all kinds of different backgrounds and stuff like that. You see frequently studies about intolerances at record highs where those communities aren't actually based. So, is that consistent with what you've kind of known, heard, experienced? And do you think that there's a hope that once more diverse groups of people move further afield across the whole of the UK, that the issue will subside, or do you think that will accentuate it more?
I think you ask a very important question, Simon. I think all the evidence and reports and the statistics points to the fact that we're in communities which are overwhelmingly disadvantaged, overwhelmingly have a large proportion of the community who are statistically and definition-wise come from working class backgrounds, and perhaps many other social factors such as perhaps poor educational attainment, intergenerational high unemployment, and these happen to also be old industrial towns in the north predominantly. And also, London is not immune to this, by the way. London is seen as this like bubble where it's far more cosmopolitan and it's far more global in many respects, but it's not immune to many of these issues. We've seen the European social, what they called again, the European Muslim Research Centre have done great research in the Islamophobic attacks in London. So London's not immune to it, but I think if you look at where it happens, why it happens, it normally happens in working class disadvantaged communities, and it normally happens when there is this, and this is using an old Marxist argument, when there is effectively a tension and a competition between different groups for the same resources. Right? This used to be my territory. Now you guys are the new kids on the block. You're not just the new kids on the block, but you're taking the jobs that we once upon a time perhaps had. You're also going to the same schools that my children went to, or now you're also competing for the same houses that perhaps would have given to me instead. And not only that, you speak a different language, you have a different religion, you look different, you smell different, and that's where racism enters that field. So essentially and effectively, for me, as a sociologist, I would argue that a lot of this is a working class struggle. However, it also intersects with the whole idea of immigration, racism, and integration. And you see this played out, not just in this country, but across the globe. And just look at, for example, the suburbs of Paris as a great example of what I've just tried to explain there.